It has been considered the greatest of Australian films and possibly the best at illustrating, communicating the white Australian, the English/Anglo/Irish or European descended Australians' psycho-ethereal relationship with the geographic environment, that feeling of being an explorer, of your introduced home opening itself up into an older world which has not completely decided whether it welcomes these younger denizens of yet. There is this feeling of wanting to feel settled in, to find comfortability and control over the environment, and this is a story taking place in the year prior to Australian Federation. It is dripping of the sweat of stuffy-suited English gentry, or prospective gentry, where some orphans are concerned anyway, and so one is doused in that feeling of insisting on settling into an alien environment. The finest photography of the Australian landscape, excluding Rogue's Walkabout, at least up to the year 1980, and plausibly of the 20th century in general. Those two films, along with Rolf de Heer's 10 Canoes of 2006, could constitute the three finest cinematographic exercises in depicting the Australian natural environment. Shepey's Jimmy Blacksmith is worth mentioning also, Pauline Kael claiming it was the finest justification of widescreen ever composed. I like to think that Picnic at Hanging Rock takes place in the same universe as Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape, directed by Peter Sasdy. The laws of our scientific, clinical, cold, atheistic reality are so unusual and frightening and strange still, so as to feel entirely or de facto, or a substitute or for phenomena once referred to as supernatural. In this respect, Picnic at Hanging Rock is the most subtle science fiction/horror or thriller film of all time, and may hold this title for all of this medium's history. If Australia has one sincere contribution to the great canon of world cinema, and one directed by an Australian, not a Canadian or Englishman, considering Wake in Fright and Walkabout respectively, let it be 1975's Picnic at Hanging Rock from Peter Weir, still his absolute finest work, though I love Year of Living Dangerously, really like Last Wave and Mosquito Coast, and also quite appreciate his pre-picnic features as well. Maybe worth considering 1981's Centre Spread by Tony Patterson, too, and who doesn't appreciate and revere Mad Max 2 The Road Warrior? I think Picnic at Hanging Rock still resonates that perpetual white Australian quasi-tense relationship with the natural environment, and honestly, it may be better if this feeling persists, for it is never worth forgetting the cultures which the land was inherited from, plundered from, and so let their insistence that there was far more to the surface of the landscape than could be materially gratifying, one which was sadistically, greedily ignored, continue to haunt the rewarded descendants of the wicked seizure of the breathing dreaming. I don't want Australia to become like America, which barely considers the native people's storyline in their culture's gravitational core. I do want the residue of the pre-colonial cultures of dreaming to affect the Australian pathologies forevermore, for Australia could become the first nation to achieve equilibrium with the nomadic synchronicity of the hunter-gatherers and the mechanical industries of organized civilization. Then she could be a guiding light for the entire globe to experience the dreaming. As a child, I came to identify the television cartoons and the children's picture books detailing the indigenous stories of the nation's formation, environmentally, geographically, spiritually, to be more of a genuinely relatable Genesis narrative for my home country or general surroundings than stories about old men or talking animals from the British Isles. Especially how Australia grew to adopt the native animals as our national icons, we became enchanted with the indigenous myths of how they, and other geographic landmarks we grew to love, came to be, a mythology that was solely their domain, as our own language's culture had been creatively tainted by the damp empiricism of the European Enlightenment. We owe any national pride we have to a reconciliation of the Indigenous Australians, and I wish my yes vote had turned the tide recently. So we like to feel tied to this country via depicting of the flora, fauna, and general landscapes in art and in media. Yet the more you travel through the continent into the country itself, that is when you realize that the land itself is not accustomed to your presence. Cotton European clothes, technology invented overseas, a sense of leisure and enjoyment totally unknown to those who had to rely on the land to live off of it. No sense of feeling in any union of the natural environment, just tourists who are feeling slightly sick of their surrounding city, usually Sydney, and having an attempted, usually with alcohol or bongs or more probably both, relaxing hangout in the mystical bush, the green acoustics of a communicating ecosystem. We used to smoke in the forest listening to Hindustani classical music, Ravi Shankar and the like, because it would make any passerbys receive us well, like we were just meditating and getting in touch with the outside world, or the inner dimensions, and also because it was just very, very good music, but even this didn't truly feel right. It felt commodified, reduced to a fancy tea set taken into the bush because it is too boring and dull otherwise. But then to listen to Indigenous Australian music in the bush as a white Australian feels crude and fetishizing in a way that many of us don't or ought not to even feel comfortable with, particularly if non-Australians want to learn of the Australian condition. Watch 4 films: 2000 Weeks, which is too difficult to access, frankly, so maybe just 3 films: Wake in Fright, Walkabout, and Picnic at Hanging Rock. New Zealanders probably know what it's like, though they are always welcome to appreciate these films if they like. They have a very fascinating film culture in their own right. We'll talk about some of those eventually. Though for now, well, that's the 1000th film of the day. Hopefully you may return for 1001, and if I'm ever so lucky, I may get to 2000 one day, and if not, it's because I hopefully found even more exciting things to do and watch these films, so there's only an uphill in that hopeful instance.